So when it comes to AI browsers, I'm going to sort of just hold my breath and wait until we actually see some security implementation involved.
All that and more on Security Intelligence. Hello and welcome to Security Intelligence, IBM's weekly cybersecurity podcast, where our expert panelists turn the biggest industry news stories into practical takeaways you can use. I'm your host, Matt Kaczynski, and this is going to be our last regular panel show of the year, and what a panel it is. We've got Austin Zeizel, Threat Intelligence Consultant, Evelyn Anderson, CSS CTO, Distinguished Engineer and Master Inventor, and Ryan Anschutz, North America Leader of X-Force Incident Response. Thank you all for being here today. Here is what we're going to talk about. Should AI companies do more for the threat intelligence community? MITRE's most dangerous software weaknesses for 2025. Is it safe to use Google to sign into other websites? And a bring your own virtual machine attack. But first, Gartner says organizations should ban AI browsers. Now, in a recent advisory titled Cybersecurity Must Block AI Browsers for Now, which kind of tells you exactly what the advisory is about, the analyst firm recommends that businesses block their employees from using AI browsers like, Comet by Perplexity, ChatGPT's Atlas. The concern stems from the fact that sensitive personal and corporate data can end up with the AI services that power these things, and also that you have an AI agent right there in the browser who might have some access to corporate systems and maybe mess with some things they shouldn't or be weaponized by malicious actors, right? And it, as if on cue this week, we also saw research come out from Straker's Star Labs about a zero-click attack that they had developed for Perplexity Comet, which basically turns the browser into a way to wipe your Google Drive just by sending an email that says, please organize my drive. So even with security measures in place, Gartner's report suggests that the complexity of the effort and the unpredictability of end users means that you're just safer banning the browsers from the workplace for now. I want to start by just asking everybody what we think of this proposal, if we agree, disagree, have anything to add. Ryan, I want to start with you. You see this proposal from Gartner. They're saying just ban the AI browsers. What's your take?
Yeah, I think I am more conservative, so I would probably lean in the direction of agreeing with this. You look at the Star Labs zero-click exploit, and that really shows why Gartner hit the brakes, right? Like one malformed prompt and your entire Google Drive is gone. That is a bit of a problem, right? So AI browsers that have the ability to create automation without accountability, where they can read, write, click, delete, all without explicit approval in the moment, is problematic from my perspectives. And I think that Star Labs really proved how dangerous that is. Triggering a workflow, in this case, triggering that workflow that wiped that Google Drive didn't require phishing. It didn't require, macros enabled or any social engineering. It just poisoned the input. And that really changes, I think, our blast radius conversation when we're talking about defending our networks and our people. We're not talking about stealing, browser cookies anymore, or tricking the user. We're talking about really full data loss that's initiated by an AI agent that you didn't directly instruct.
I'm glad you kind of brought up how different this is from some of those traditional attacks where, like you said, you're social engineering, you're stealing cookies from a browser. This is just an email you send. And not just that, but it relies on one of the kind of benefits that the AI browsers are supposed to bring you, right? They say, hey, look, these browsers, they'll take care of the stuff that's in your inbox for you. If there's a to-do list in your inbox, they'll do it for you. If somebody sends you a malicious to-do list, all of a sudden the AI agent is weaponized and it's barely even a hack, right? Austin, let me move on to you. When you look at this proposal from Gartner, are you agreeing, disagreeing? What are your thoughts here?
So no, I definitely agree with Gartner here. Their opinion isn't alarmist. I'd say it's rather pragmatic. Until vendors mature their security posture, we're going to see a lot of issues with AI browsers, and organizations should really enforce strict policies on AI browser use, especially in regulated sectors. AI browsers are still very new, as we know, and there's a lot of space for vulnerabilities here, in my opinion. We're really lacking a lot of different security issues, still with chatbots and Gen AI tools rather than just the browsers themselves. Now, with integrated AI browsers, you introduce an entirely new attack surface with things like prompt injection, data exfiltration, and then, of course, as Ryan mentioned, the zero-click exploits from Star Labs. So better boundaries of trust need to be established here moving forward.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think that, it's not just that we're seeing these zero-click exploits in our inboxes, but even just on public web pages, right? We've seen the ability to put in these malicious prompts that your agent can read and it can act. So it's like you said, the attack surface just blows up. It's everywhere all of a sudden. Evelyn, I'd like to get your take on Gartner's recommendations. Agree, disagree, where you land in here?
I actually agree with both Ryan and Austin. In all honesty, when I first saw this, the one thing that really stood out for me was the statement around prioritize user experience over security. And so I went out and did a bit more of research looking at some of the other, people that had responded to this, some of the experts within this field, looking at some additional articles. And for the most part, many in the community, in the cybersecurity community, they actually agreed, but there were a few that felt like the ban was more, kind of the classic shadow IT theater, which was a bit comical to me because, we all know that governance and security are critical. But it did cause me to wonder when you're looking at this, how many agents are already embedded in within the enterprise? And how effective will the ban actually be on protecting against some of the key risks? I mean, when we looked at some of the things that they pointed out about being able to send web content, accessing the browser, I think what was a couple of the others, like being able to, click and access backends autonomously and execute transactions. That actually did make me wonder how effective this would be. I think it's the first step, but I think it's critical that we all kind of get together, figure out what are the correct security controls that need to be in place around how we're securing AI as a whole, and what is the governance structure.
I'm glad you bring that up because it kind of segues into exactly what I wanted to ask you folks about, which was, you know, how do we start thinking about tightening security for these kinds of things, right? Because Gartner even points out, look, there are security measures you can put in place, and their take is kind of like, but even if you put them in place, it might not be enough, so you might as well just avoid it. But I'm thinking specifically of some of the recommendations that came out of the Straker Labs research that we've been talking about, where they said, you know what, one of the things you might want to do is require a human to review any instructions that are in content, right? And by that they mean any instructions an agent comes across that didn't come directly from the user, whether they're in an email or they're on a web page. One thing you can do is just make sure that the agent has to review that stuff with a human before it can act. The other thing that was interesting to me was we also saw that Google has taken some steps to protect its own agents embedded in Chrome, and it announced, this is really interesting to me, a user alignment critic, which is a different model that's put there to evaluate the agent's plan, right? So when the agent gets some instructions, it comes up with a plan to execute them, and then it has to pass through this other model, the user alignment critic, which kind of evaluates the plan, makes sure it looks good. If it doesn't, it kicks it back to the agent. If it does, it allows it to. And I think those are some pretty inventive ways to start safeguarding these things. And I wanted to get your thoughts as the kind of security experts here. Is that kind of thing, is it promising to you? Do you think we're heading in the right direction? What would you like to see? Austin, I want to start with you. When you think about safeguarding these AI browsers, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think some of these things are promising, and there could be some advancements here, but really from a security standpoint, and in my opinion, I still think it's too early to just jump in and to risk it. Really give it more time to develop. And I sort of analogize this to Mac OS software updates where, the latest OS comes out and everyone, rushes to download it. Then you find out that it's littered with different bugs and vulnerabilities and security flaws. So I usually like to kind of take a step back and, wait for that 1.1 version to come out until anything, right? So when it comes to AI browsers, I'm going to sort of just hold my breath and wait until we actually see some security implementation involved.
I think that's an extremely good point, right? Maybe wait for the 1.1 of ChatGPT's Atlas. You know what I mean? Evelyn, how about you? What kind of things would you like to see them implement to make you feel more comfortable with them?
I think Austin was spot on. I mean, the very first thing that I thought about when he said that was, when releases come out, unfortunately, I tend to lag a little bit to wait to find out what's going to break before I jump in and make install the updates. I think Google is first, because of the one-click issue that they're trying to offset kind of the light shining on them. So it's out there and we're all scrambling, trying to figure out what should and should not be in place. And I don't think we know. The biggest thing is that we can put different controls in place. I think it's going to take a collaborative effort between multiple bodies to figure out what is the right approach. Right now, we're just trying to pull rabbits out of our hat and hope that it works. And I don't think we have the right answers yet. I think it's going to take some actual time in the lab testing, trying to figure out, okay, what are the risks that are out there? And if we put this in place, does it mitigate this risk? Yes or no? And move on. But right now, we're just being a bit more reactive to every time a new problem arises. We're trying to identify something as a quick fix versus us taking the time to be a bit more, saying, okay, these are the potential exposures and this is how we could actually close them. So I think it's going to take some time. And the path that we're taking is not necessarily the right one. It's, one to be reactive to try to address the problems, but I don't know that it's the right approach that we're taking right now.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I think that especially when it comes to this AI-related stuff and these agents, they're new, they're shiny, they're very exciting, and it can feel sometimes like there's a lot of pressure to be among those early adopters. But, there is wisdom in waiting a little bit. Ryan, to close out the segment, I'd like to get your take. You look at these AI browsers, what would you like to see them do? Is there anything they could do to make you more comfortable with them?
Yeah, I think, Evelyn mentioned it really well. She mentioned one specific word, and that's collaboration. And I think that's going to be on a lot of us, from security companies to vendors to implementers, because the answer is we can't avoid AI browsers forever, right? I think from a security standpoint, if we are able to wrap them in the same or similar guardrails that we currently already build, like for cloud workflows or any type of privileged automation, I think that is a really, promising way forward, because those tools now, those act on our behalf, right? So they need permission scopes, decision logs, and actually real isolation. So when we actually treat the AI autonomy like a privileged user instead of just maybe a passive browser, I think that would dramatically reduce our risk, and then allow innovation to actually scale safely.
Yeah, I like that you point out that, and because I think a lot of times with some of these AI-related conversations, there's a tendency to feel like everything is brand new. And like you're saying, there is a precedent here. There are things we can look at that apply to this stuff. So sure, it may be very exciting technology that's different from some things we've seen. But like you said, we've dealt with similar things in the past. We can apply some of those same approaches to this sort of thing. And you also almost kind of read my mind in talking about the collaboration that's necessary, because that's exactly what I want to talk about in our next segment. Where do AI companies fit into the threat intelligence landscape? Now, all this conversation about AI browser safety also brings to mind a recent LinkedIn post that I saw from Rob T. Lee, who is Chief AI Officer at the SANS Institute. Now, to give you a little context, back in November, as I'm sure we all recall, Anthropic busted this AI-powered espionage ring that was using Claude to automate significant portions of its campaign. And it was a pretty big deal. It was one of the more sophisticated, uses we've seen for these tools. And so the report garnered a lot of attention, and it also garnered a little bit of backlash. Specifically, some cybersecurity pros felt that it left out really valuable threat intelligence information, like specifically indicators of compromise. I saw a lot of people say, how come we can't get any IOCs, right? And as Lee put it on LinkedIn, and this is a direct quote from him, AI providers now sit in the middle of these attacks, and we don't yet have clear expectations for how they detect abuse and notify victims, right? So part of what we're dealing with here is that these vendors are entering the kind of attack surface, the blast radius, in a way that they hadn't before, and we haven't sussed out what that looks like, where they fit into the collaboration. So Austin, I wanted to start with you first. You do a lot of work in threat intelligence. Where do you think AI organizations fit into this landscape? What, if anything, do they, I don't know, owe cybersecurity professionals when it comes to these kinds of things?
So again, we're so early in this technological revolution of AI, and the providers are really sitting in the center of all this abuse happening, but are really lacking the ability to formally detect and disclose this victim abuse that we're seeing. And we also see that the AI providers are able to disrupt some of these AI-powered espionage campaigns, but we really need standardized frameworks in place here, because right now the expectations are pretty unclear across the industry. There's no standard for how AI providers detect malicious use, when they notify victims, or even how intelligence is shared with defenders. So threat intel teams really should prioritize tracking AI misuse patterns, behavior, and then pressure these vendors for transparency. Because within AI, we've been talking about how important governance and compliance is becoming. So that really weaves into that aspect here.
Absolutely. Now, Ryan, I want to ask you about something else that came up in Rob's post, which was this idea, and it's not just Rob, I shouldn't say it like that, because it's actually come up with a lot of people, but there's this view that even if Anthropic had shared IOCs, it wouldn't be that much use to defenders, because most defenders aren't defending generative AI models, right? So the idea is that, like, why are we so upset about Anthropic not sharing some of this stuff? Could we actually use it? I want to get your take. Do you think it's true that the IOCs wouldn't be of much use to defenders, or where do you land on that?
I kind of land in the middle. And it just depends on what IOCs are, what are we looking for? At that time, Anthropic really, they can see, or any other AI vendor really, if we're talking about, threat chains or, inside that attack chain, they can see the malicious workflows forming in real time. That could be prompts, that could be patterns, iterations. That is the pre-attack intelligence that, as defenders, we never usually get. And that's not a typical, what you would consider a classic IOC, right? You're looking at really behavioral aspects. And, Rob said AI providers, they sit in the middle of these attacks. 100% agree with that. And I think just by sitting in the middle of these attacks, you inherit new responsibilities. Even if you're not a cybersecurity company, it's about setting a baseline set of expectations to, detect abuse signals, sharing those aggregated threat patterns that would be important to organizations that are potentially, maybe a victim, even notifying victims, even when their data or identity is actually being weaponized. I think that ignoring the AI in the threat chain would repeat the cloud security mistakes that we made 10 years ago. I think we learned very slowly that cloud providers were critical intelligence partners. And AI is just that next evolution, as we mentioned, before. And I would say that we're not asking AI vendors to police the internet. That would be completely unreasonable. But we're asking them not to ignore the crime scene happening within their own platform.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you're developing a theme here, right? Which I think it makes a lot of sense. There's so much that we can kind of learn from the cloud security kind of moment and the cloud security evolution, right? That can apply to some of this stuff. And I again, for me, this is a new lens on it, because I never really considered how, in many ways, these AI services, these AI models are kind of a new evolution of that cloud service arrangement. Just, now it's got some slightly fancier capabilities. Evelyn, I wanted to ask you about another kind of common response I've seen to this conversation. which is that there is some concern that maybe if these AI vendors release too much information about this kind of stuff, too much about the IOCs or the prompts or the technical specifics, it would be almost like handing the threat actors a playbook on how to jailbreak an AI, right? And so I'm kind of wondering, how do you feel about that and that balance you need to strike between giving away too much but keeping your collaborators informed? What's your take?
I think Austin and Ryan actually expressed it very, very well here. It's kind of funny how all of our minds have gone with this. When I started looking at this, the very first thought that came in my head is we need to establish this similar to the cloud where we establish a responsibility matrix. I mean, when we're looking at the structure and I don't think we can absolve the AI providers and say, okay, when I started reading the article and he was looking at it to give them a break, I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't have gone that far. But I think this is going back to kind of what we said earlier. We really have to take a step back, and there has to be real, true collaboration between the cybersecurity firms, the AI providers, et cetera. There are no clear controls, regulations, frameworks around this space. I work within the within the regulatory agency where I'm always reviewing regulations. It was a little bit comical to me when I started just looking at the US, and we have 50 states. But when I started looking at the actual guidelines and regulations and controls that were coming across just the United States, there were over 335. Some of them were regulations, some of them were laws, some were were executive orders, some of them were guidance, which told me that everyone was confused on exactly what we should and shouldn't be doing and how to actually structure this. And until we bring all of those people together to provide the appropriate guidance, then I think we're going to continue down this, path of the finger pointing. I don't think it's just a scenario that the AI providers can solve, nor is it just something that the cybersecurity firms can solve on their own. I think we have to work together. There's no way for us to really determine how we actually put the proper security and governance controls in place that are really going to safeguard enterprises and provide, faster mitigation to make sure that we have and understand the clear rules on what should be there versus what's not there. And then if it's exploited, how do we mitigate it quickly? And some of the information, I mean, regardless of what it is and how they were exploited, we need to understand that. And right now, I think not providing the detailed information when it came to Anthropics, they provided some information, but quite a few felt like that they really didn't give you enough information that you would have been able to do anything with. And so I think that's something that we have to take a closer look at. I understand you don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom, but how do we fix it if we don't understand? I can't fix something if I don't understand how it occurred.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you point out that, some of the fog that it feels like we're dealing with around how we handle this stuff is just about that lack of collaboration and coming together and defining these things, right? I think, again, it's very easy to feel like, oh, this technology is so new and unprecedented that this confusion is inherent to it, but it's not really, right? We have this, again, all three of you have pointed out, we have some precedents for this, especially that cloud model, that cloud responsibility matrix you were talking about, Evelyn. So let's start with what we know and start applying it to what we have here. I feel so much better about this now, having talked to you three. I got to say, you have lightened the burden on me. So let's go ahead and move on then to the next story we got to cover today, which is the 2025 CWE Top 25 Most Dangerous Software Weaknesses. MITRE recently published its 2025 CWE Top 2025 Most Dangerous Software Weaknesses, which is, as you might guess, a list of the software design and implementation flaws that underlie the most frequently exploited vulnerabilities in the wild. Some notable bits up top. The top three were the cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and cross-site request forgery. Missing authorization jumped up 5 spots from last year, so it was number 9, now it's number 4. Don't like to see something like that, but those are the two things that stuck out to me. However, I am not the security expert here, so I want to know what sticks out to you folks when you look at this list. And I'll start with you, Evelyn. You look at this list of flaws. What sticks out to you? What comes to mind for you?
When I looked at it and the way the article read, it led you to believe that there's been improvement. And then I kind of chuckled saying, okay, let me take I can be cynical from time to time. So let me take a step back and look at it a little differently. But the first thing that I noted was, when you look at cross-site scripting, SQL injections and the cross-site request forgery, they were still in the top 3 positions. They didn't change. But so my initial thought was, I mean, should I really look at this as it's been an improvement or because these are the key root causes of the majority of the exploits and breaches that we see out there. And then when I started looking at some of the IAM, pieces around the authorization moving up, I'm like, okay, so can we say that there's been improvements? Okay. But I feel like that when it comes to this, the messaging that we really should be taking away from this is that defenders need to continue to drive secure by design, initiatives. They need to make sure that they're building actual checklists based on using this as to build out their strategic roadmap and how they're prioritizing their risk mitigation and reviewing their code, to make sure that they have secure development. So I was a little bit cynical, I will admit, when I looked at this, because I didn't necessarily, when you looked at the word dropped, it was a bit subjective to me, I guess is what I'll say about this one.
No, that makes sense. And I did have a similar thought. I feel like every time we get these lists, it's always the cross-site scripting, the SQL injection. It's that those injection attacks are like always right there at the top. And it, I kind of wonder why they're so persistent. And I don't know, Austin, I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do you have any thoughts about why they're so persistent? Why these injection attacks are so popular, so common? Any thoughts there?
The really striking thing is not a lot has changed with this list. Despite all the talk around supply chain attacks, AI, 0 days, most of these breaches that we're seeing all go back to decades-old vulnerabilities. And the reason we're seeing a lot of cross-site scripting, SQL injection, is because it's really easy on the defender side to carry these attacks out. Now, from the defensive side of things, this goes well beyond patching. As Evelyn pointed out, secure by design principles really need to be implemented into the software development lifecycle. AI, when it comes to AI-related weaknesses and supply chains, those are creeping up the list. So it is signaling a slight shift here. But when we look at the top 25 year over year, it's pretty much the same. It really signals to organizations and security professionals that this has become a blueprint for adversaries. And if you see it on the list, then you should assume that attackers are weaponizing it and going to leverage this when they carry out attacks against organizations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ryan, let's bring you in here. You look at this list, you look at the persistence of these decades-old vulnerabilities. Do you have the same kind of cynicism that Evelyn has about this sort of thing? Do you feel like, how come we haven't moved? What's your take?
I do. I feel like this is PTSD from the OWASP list. This MITRE list is really less about what's new and more about what we still refuse to fix. This isn't a list of emerging threats. It's that report card, essentially, of fundamentals that we get wrong or fundamentals that we haven't fixed. I think these are indicative of foundational engineering failures. This isn't exotic AI age vulnerabilities. This is input validation errors, authorization mistakes, insecure object handling, really the boring stuff. The boring stuff continues to drive real breaches, and attackers love this because it's predictable. And while, defenders were over here maybe partly chasing some AI hype, our adversaries are exploiting the same top 25 weaknesses with a 99% success rate. So even with the rise of AI, it doesn't change the list. It accelerates our exploitation. It helps attackers discover, chain, and even weaponize those weaknesses faster than ever. I would say the message for defenders or even engineering teams, really, if we're not using this list as essentially like an OKR with some type of measurable improvement in our environment, then we're just simply guaranteeing attackers an entry point. And to talk about kind of circling back to the injection attacks, Ejection attacks are still everywhere because they exploit the oldest and probably the most universal truth in software, where anytime user controlled input touches any type of sensitive logic, there's a risk there. And we are still building systems where our inputs are not sanitized, validated, or even isolated. I would argue that the reason we're not fixing it is merely cultural at this point and not technical. Secure coding is rarely enforced, and developers are really under pressure to ship and deliver features, and legacy applications never get rewritten. I think that is a really a foundational and fundamental problem. And injection attacks are going to continue to persist because attackers they only need one missed validation. And in most organizations, there's always one.
You know, it's funny, and I did not have this thought until you were talking just then, which is that, like, even when it comes to these new AI attacks that we're worried about, what's the main one? It's prompt injection. It's another injection attack, right? Like, even when it comes to this new stuff, we're still dealing with this question of how do you deal with it when that user input kind of touches, the back end, the data, right? And I don't know what we do about that. I think we've heard some pretty good ideas here, but yeah, I think it is a little bit disheartening to see that we haven't had a ton of movement. I just want to, and we've kind of touched on this already, but I just want to let everybody speak on this before we move on to the next one, which is that, you look at this list, and as Ryan said, you take it as like a set of OKRs for development going forward. What's your kind of key takeaway then for defenders, right, looking at this list? Like, what should they walk away from this being able to do with it so that it's not just a list that you look at and you say, geez, this is a bummer. We're still dealing with the same old stuff. Austin, let's start with you. What would you say? How do you turn this into practical action?
Put it simply here, defenders need to map this list to their technology stack. Focus on automation, detection, and prioritizing that education for your engineers and your developers, and really treating this list as a board-level strategic risk tool.
That makes perfect sense. Evelyn, how about you? Any thoughts there?
Pretty much agree. I mean, this is, don't quite understand why it's not used as I would build my project plans using this list of, the checks that we're going to go through, making sure that we're aligning with secure coding practices, making sure we're automating the scans, that when we do our own penetration testing before we release code. I mean, so to me, it should be best practice by now, but, as a part of secure, by design, but I don't understand why we're still struggling with this, because when I first read this and I looked at it, I was like, wait, I was looking at this 10 years ago. We still haven't made any changes. And I mean, cross-scripting and prompt injections, all of these things were the same thing that we were looking at more than 10 years ago. So, and especially my core was in identity and access management. So when I was looking at some of the authentication issues, I was like, wow, we may have changed the mechanism in which we authenticate, but we're still having singing the same song. It's just, a different choir. So I struggled with understanding why we're still struggling with this, if you want me to be honest.
No, I get that. And Ryan, I know I kind of used your answer to turn it into a question here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a chance. Was there anything else you wanted to add on this?
I would definitely keep it short and sweet. For organizations and defenders, if we truly want to reduce breach risk meaningfully in 2026, we have to start by eliminating this top 25. I think everything else is merely optimization at this point.
Once again, are kind of gesturing towards the next story already, so I'm going to roll into it. Is consumer SSO safe? In a recent article, ZDNet senior contributing editor David Berlind weighs the pros and cons of consumer-oriented SSO schemes. That's his name for it. You also hear these things called social logins, right? It's like when you go to a website and instead of making your own account, you log in with Google, you log in with Facebook. We've all seen these options. And they're extremely handy, right? It's very convenient. You don't have to set up a new account. But that also means you're setting up a kind of single point of failure, right? If all of your accounts are tied to the same Gmail account, if someone steals that account, they can get into all the rest of those accounts, right? And that reminds me of on last week's show, we talked about this attack where hackers can take over your Gmail account and lock you out by changing your age. So it's like, look at how bad that can be, right? But on the other hand, some people say, look, there is that single point of failure. But your Googles, your Facebooks, these platforms, they tend to have more robust security than some random website. So like if the choice is between putting your information into a random website or using a bigger platform, maybe use the bigger platform. And I get that. But, I think about how we just looked at this list, right? And saw these identity and authentication weaknesses still being there, still being big ones. And I think about the fact that like every new X-Force Threat Intelligence Index that comes out is like, what's the number one attack? It's valid account abuse, right? It's just stealing credentials and using that. So, given that we have all of these pressures on identity security at this moment, I want your takes on where you land in this debate. Are social logins safe? And you know what? We'll start with Ryan on this one. Ryan, what's your take? You feel like these things are safe? Where do you land?
I don't know if I would use safe in those exact terms. I like talking in risk, right? But I would say it's both safer and riskier. I think it just really shifts where we are placing the danger, right? So like if we upgrade our authentication strength, but we're also centralizing failure into that single identity provider. I would say for most people, Google or Apple login is way more secure than a password that's reused across 30 sites, right? The protections are stronger, the fraud detection is better, and MFA adoption, I would say, is higher. But if we look at the flip side of that, if something were to be compromised, that blast radius that we always talk about, that blast radius is real. If an attacker compromises your primary identity, they then inherit everything connected to it. Your banking, your apps, your cloud data, medical portals, whatever that might be, right? And attackers are, as you mentioned, are increasingly targeting those account linking and recovery flows. So it's really not the SSO providers themselves. They go after the back doors, not the front door. I think so. I guess the real answer is probably conditional. SSO is safe if you pair it with strong MFA, good recovery hygiene, and visibility into what accounts are federated and what accounts are not. I would say consumer SSO is safe when you treat it like a security control, not just a convenience shortcut.
That's an extremely good point, right? And I wanted to just emphasize, as you pointed out, what we often see when people don't use this stuff is they just use the same password across a bunch of different websites. And again, that's how so many attackers get into people's accounts, right? You get a leaked credential from somewhere, they'll just go try it on a whole bunch of websites and see where it works, and often works way more than it should. Evelyn, let's bring you into this. You're looking at this question of are these things safe, or maybe in Ryan's word, how do they affect the risk? Where's your take? Where do you land?
I love when Ryan said convenience shortcut, because it made me it really made me think about that. This was a definitely a thought-provoking question, because when I stop and take a step back, how many of us, when we created a social media account, was really thinking about strong credentials? Thinking about, okay, let me make sure that I'm using a strong password with MFA, blah blah, and that I'm not tying it to something that if it's compromised, it could potentially have this massive impact on my life. So I'll be the first one to say that when I set up a Facebook account years ago, no, I was not thinking security. And so I had to, but I only use that account on just that platform. So if you steal it, you steal it. No, but in all honesty, being serious about this, I have to admit, this really made me think about, now I have been laxed in getting passkeys set up everywhere. But it really made me think about, with technology advancements, the importance of setting up, the passkeys, making sure that you have MFA, for important websites like my banking, financial, things of that nature. I don't authenticate using any form of Google anywhere. But, my mind is thinking security. The average person may not actually be thinking about that. So this was one that really made me take a step back and say, okay, Evelyn, I don't want you to be hypocritical here. So think back on every credential that you set up over the years. Did you really take the security aspect into play? And where have you not set up passkeys that you should have set up passkeys? So this did make me actually go back and do a little bit of inventory on my life, saying where I needed to clean up. And I think everyone has to do that. I mean, single sign-on is great when it's used properly. And I commend, the Google, the Apple for giving you that additional capability to be able to authenticate. But Ryan said it best. I mean, if this one area is exploited, exposed, if they're able to breach and steal my credentials, how many other avenues am I opening them up to? And I think that's something that end users have to really think about when they're going through and setting up these single sign-on mechanisms.
Absolutely. And I think that you're right in that these things aren't necessarily presented to the end user as a security play, right? It's a convenience thing, right? Like you're absolutely same with me. When I set up my Facebook years ago, I was not thinking about security at all, right? And then I saw, I can sign into another website with Facebook. Yeah, why not? No one ever said a word to me about security. So I do think there's some messaging that needs to happen there. Austin, your take on the debate, where do you fall?
You mentioned convenience. We always sacrifice security for convenience, especially for consumers that want that. So for enterprises relying on consumer single sign-on for critical applications, I think that can be fine. But these applications need to be low risk, as that can improve their usability, but it certainly shouldn't be the standard. So as Evelyn pointed out, I think we should integrate passkeys, integrate that with MFA. Passkeys eliminate shared secrets and reduce the risk of phishing by using that authentication through cryptography, which is tied to the user's device. But again, there's no one size fits all. And I think when it comes to password security, it's good to have layered defenses involved. I always tell friends and family about a password manager. Yeah, you have one specific password that's tied to everything, but that's the one password that you need to protect. And then when you integrate things like MFA, passkeys, and SSO into sort of a one solution there, then you are much more secure, and then you don't run into these issues or those single points of failure.
Absolutely. So I think the kind of broad takeaway here is that, as with so many things in security world, it's not black and white. It's conditional, to use Ryan's word, right? It's not necessarily that is the SSO itself secure so much as what are you putting around that thing and what kind of defense and depth do you have? And that's the real question. Because if you're only relying on one password for anything, no matter what it is, SSO or not, it's not good. That's not a good passkeys. We like passkeys, folks. Let's move on, though, to our last story because we are running out of time here. Red Canary researchers outline a bring your own virtual machine attack. Now, the security operations from Red Canary reported on a recent incident they helped address in which a spam bombing campaign ultimately led to a malicious virtual machine on the victim's system. Real quick, it went like this. The attack started with a campaign to flood the victim's inbox with a bunch of thousands of emails. So a lot of important notifications were obscured. And also this put people on high alert. Next, the attacker calls the victim and says, hey, I'm technical support. I can help you with this problem. The victim, not thinking clearly because they're being inundated with these messages, takes them up on the offer, gives them remote access to their computer using Quick Assist. And at that point, the attacker drops their own virtual machine in there using a Visual Basic script, and it gives them this very strong persistence and control. Now, what was interesting to me was, I've heard of bring your own driver attacks or whatever before, but this is the first time I've heard of a bring your own virtual machine attack. And so I just wanted to start by asking if this is something that anybody's seen before. Austin, have you ever heard of something like this before, bring your own virtual machine attack?
Not specifically. But what's so interesting about this form of attack that, it's not your standardized, say, malware. It's infrastructure within your infrastructure that can really go undetected. And it's a reminder that attackers don't need these complex 0 days. They just need some creativity and patience here. A virtual machine can survive reboots, evade host detection, and even run its own tool set isolated from a main operating systems. And most organizations don't have the practices in place to monitor any hypervisor activity from these virtual machines. So really the lesson here is to monitor any unexpected behavior or activity from these virtual machines and to expand that across your endpoint detection and response. Because by ensuring your endpoint security tools can detect any of these nested environments, that will really go a long way. And what's also interesting here is they can sort of go under the radar. So simply by analyzing resources within your environments, like different spikes of memory and CPU, that will sort of indicate for defenders that maybe there's something more going on here.
I like that. Yeah. And that's a real concrete way to kind of monitor for some of these, like you said, infrastructure within your infrastructure attacks, which in a way we're kind of going for full circle because that's sort of what some of these AI abuses are, right? It's sort of attackers using your infrastructure against you or setting up their kind of own infrastructure within your system. So I like that we're starting to talk more about how you detect that and not just malware. Ryan, I wanted to ask you, building on that, we talked about the VM, the virtual machine, but I also wanted to ask you about this kind of spam bombing campaign because it's not necessarily something I've seen before again. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Have you seen anything like that? This kind of flooding the victim with this noise to put him on edge? What's your take there?
Yeah, I think each one of these is kind of situational. And in this particular one, I think, no, we don't. I guess to answer that, no, we don't see that all too often. But I would argue that the surrounding tradecraft in this situation, this email bombing, the social engineering, the remote access abuse, I would say is classic misdirection. It's creating noise. So the defender actually never thinks to look for a hypervisor artifact that's quietly spinning in the background, right? So I think that really, the attack in general, I think it forces us really to rethink where the endpoint, I use endpoint in quotations, where the endpoint actually is. And if attackers can import their own operating system into your operating system, then your visibility model isn't just incomplete, it would be essentially obsolete. And I loved this article. I think this really is a masterclass on, I know we talked about infrastructure, but I kind of wanted to shift back to the malware, what I call the 4 truths of malware. Modern threat actors have what I call the 4 truths of malware, where all malware must run, hide, communicate, and persist. And sometimes our tools are not designed to see all of this, right? So in this particular case, the malware must run, right? So the attacker didn't run code on the host. They ran it inside of the virtual machine. So that execution or that running happens in a sandbox. The defender actually never inspects, which entirely bypasses EDR. When we talk about hiding, the VM is, I would argue, is really a perfect hiding place. Instead of hiding a simple process, they're actually hiding an entire operating system parallel to the host, right? So it's invisible to actually the traditional monitoring standards that we've come accustomed to. When we talk about communication, inside that virtual machine, that attacker can use their own tooling at their free will, their own C2 channels, their own networking stack, right? That host operating system is creating traffic that just looks like normal virtualization activity or even benign resource usage. And we talk about the 4th one is persistence. The persistence here isn't just a registry key or a scheduled task. The persistence is actually the VM itself, which I think is really fascinating. And if the virtual machine actually survives a reboot or a user login, that attacker really has a long-term beachhead, really, with no conventional indicators. So I really think that if all malware must run, hide, communicate, and persist, then it's scary. But virtual machines would be the ultimate way to do all 4 without ever touching the host. I think that fundamentally should change how we think about our endpoint defense and the telemetry that goes into that.
Absolutely. And those four truths, I really like that because it's like, is the VM malware or not? It almost doesn't matter, right? It's accomplishing the same thing, right? It's doing the same thing. And like you said, it's doing the same thing, maybe even better than traditional malware does. So at that point, the categorization distinction is like, it's moot, all right? It's moot. We're dealing with something big. Evelyn, to close out the episode, I just wanted to get your take looking at this sort of report. What do you think the key takeaways are for defenders when it comes to the rise of these, not the rise, I shouldn't say, because it's the first one I've seen, but the fact that this is a possibility now, these bring your own virtual machine attacks. What's your takeaways?
I definitely think that Ryan did an outstanding job breaking this down and explaining it. The only thing that I would probably add to, and which was really covered here, was that we have to look at this from a visibility, looking at the virtualization layers, where we have to make sure that we're monitoring any unauthorized VMs. This was a very unique, interesting case that I mean, they were definitely thinking outside of the box. I mean, who would have thought that at some point that an attacker would have thought, you know what, I'm not going to go in the normal way. I'm going to bring my own VM. And so just thinking about I mean, it's like I feel like they need an award for thinking outside of the box, but because it's something very, very unique that I must admit, when I read it, I had to go back and read it again and then start doing some research on it, because I started thinking about all the risks that are associated with this and how we will be able to detect it.
No, I get that. And it is an amazing bit of misdirection, I think was the word that Ryan used, right? Like this classic misdirection. You do almost want to give him a reward, but you don't. Gotta hand it to him, folks. But that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank our panelists, Austin, Evelyn, and Ryan. Thank you to the viewers and the listeners. As I mentioned up top, this is the last regular panel episode of the year, but it's not the last show of the year. Look out for our special 2025 Year in Review episode next week. And the week after that, we're going to have an in-depth interview with regular panelist Michelle Alvarez, where we dive into why it costs so much to get hacked in America. And if you can't get enough of IBM's podcasts, and who can, be sure to subscribe to Techsplainers wherever you get your podcasts. This is a daily audio-only show where IBM writers give you a crash course in hot tech topics, including our very own producer Brian Clark delivering a 5-part series on cybersecurity fundamentals. Again, that's Techsplainers on Apple, Spotify, wherever else you listen to podcasts. And as always, subscribe to Security Intelligence wherever podcasts are found, and stay safe out there.